When Magic the Gathering was first developed in the early 1990s, Wizards of the Coast needed quick, reliable ways of generating art for their new card game. In the early years, they worked with only a handful of artists who were dependable and certainly qualified for the job. These artists created some of the most iconic Magic cards in history, like Black Lotus, the Moxes, and Plague Queen. In a game of Magic the Gathering, you build your deck out of 60 cards, and are allowed no more than 4 copies of a single card. In order to make their deck as consistent as possible, most people will make decks that use 4 copies of every card they wish to use. Over time, when Magic cards are reprinted, they'll often have their art changed to drum up new interest, which means that after almost 30 years of the game's history, many cards have various alternative arts. For example, I use 4 copies of one of my favorite cards, Llanowar Elves, in my Magic deck, and I get to customize it by running 4 different arts that I think look cool. There are multiple different formats that you can play Magic in. The standard way of playing, which is fittingly called Standard, allows you to use cards only from the most recent few sets, so every few months new cards are added to the legal pool of cards, and then some are removed, creating a ever-rotating pool of cards to build a deck from. This is the same way that the Pokemon card game works. There is also a format called Legacy, which does not rotate, but instead allows the use of every card that has ever been printed in Magic going back to its beginning. This is the same way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Works. I have been playing Magic since 2010, and while I enjoyed going to tournaments and playing one-on-one with guys at my local gaming store, most of my time spent playing Magic was with my friends in one of our basements. The problem is that with a big group of people, it's kind of hard to have a bunch of one-on-one matches, and it especially sucks if there are 5 people present. On top of that, it gets boring after a while facing the same few well-toned decks that are designed to be as consistent as possible. Every game starts to play out almost identically. Thankfully, all of our problems were answered with the invention of a new way of playing Magic, created not by Wizards of the Coast, but by the fans. There is a movie called Highlander, starring Sean Connery, about a race of immortal beings that live on Earth. These immortals can only be killed by other immortals, and when one kills the other, they gain all of their power. That means that as time goes on, power is held by fewer and fewer people, but all of the remaining people are incredibly strong. The end result, and the tagline of the movie, is that there can only be one.
There can be only one.
Whoever the last remaining immortal is, becomes almighty. Also, the bad guy in this movie is played by Mr. Krabs.
You will always be weaker than I.
So Magic the Gathering has a format called Highlander, which, as the name might suggest, there can only be 1 copy of each card. The deck uses 100 cards, but instead of having 4 copies of each, you can only use 1. This creates a lot more varied gameplay, so games are much less likely to turn out the same, and it's harder to actually be consistent. A group of Magic fans in the early 2000s, although there isn't really a set date for when this happened, put a spin on the Highlander format. See, in Magic lore, there are creatures called the Elder Dragons, most famously, Nicol Bolas. These friends all picked one of the dragons and made it the head of their army, or the commander of their deck, and their deck could only use cards of the same color as their dragon. The games could be played by more than 2 people, so things like the order that you were sitting in, or how much you liked your one particular friend that day, and the politics of negotiating affected the game just as much as deck building, strategy, and luck. Thus, Elder Dragon Highlander, or EDH, was born. In 2011, Wizards of the Coast turned EDH into an official Magic format, renaming it Commander so that they didn't get sued. Commander lets you use cards dating back to Magic's inception, and thus you have access to a lot of powerful cards, but because you're limited to 1 of each and the colors of your commander, that balances out how powerful your deck can become. Wizards printed pre-constructed decks for Commander that they sold in stores with cards in them that hadn't been printed in decades, because those cards would be too powerful in normal play. The most powerful of these cards is an unassuming artifact called Soul Ring. In Magic, in order to do anything, you need mana. Mana is created by land cards, but you can only play one land card per turn, meaning that normally every turn your potential for gaining mana goes up by either 0 or 1, depending on if you have a land in your hand. But Sol Ring breaks that concept entirely. For the cost of 1 mana, you can play Sol Ring, which itself creates 2 mana. That means that on turn 1 you can have 2 mana, and on turn 2 you can have 4. This puts you miles ahead of your opponents if they don't have a Sol Ring. This, on top of the fact that Sol Ring is colorless, meaning it can go in any EDH deck, makes it essentially an auto-include in every single deck ever made. So if you're playing a game of EDH with 4 people, it's not a question of if you're going to see a Sol Ring, it's a question of when. There are a lot of phrases and memes that have originated in the Magic community. Things like Bolt the Bird, which refers to using a card called Lightning Bolt to kill a creature called Birds of Paradise, because both can be played on turn 1, and Bolt is a perfect counter to Bird. There are other things that are unique to my friend group that arose naturally over a decade of playing the game, like jokingly calling for a judge if someone makes a particularly impressive play, or making fun of the card Vorinclex and pretending it's worthless despite it being incredibly powerful. But my playgroup's favorite and most often used meme is about Sol Ring. Because Sol Ring is such a devastating thing to have your opponent play against you, there's almost a feeling of cockiness when you're able to proudly slap one down on the table and instantly jump into the lead. This led to the almost ritualistic tendency of my group of friends to begin to declare whenever they played a Sol Ring, "I'm a Sol Ring." This is obviously a reference to the song Soul Man, which was popularized by the 1980 film Blues Brothers, and repopularized for my generation by an episode of Drake and Josh. I'm a soul man. I'm a soul man. So imagine for 10 years, every time you played Magic the Gathering, in fact, multiple times per game, the game would be halted by someone's heartfelt performance of Soul Man, replacing the word man with ring. Now, imagine that you're walking around Magic Fest, which is a Magic the Gathering convention, surrounded by Black Lotuses and foil Jace the Mind Sculptors and thousands of people playing cards and making purchases for larger sums than most cars go for. And across the convention hall, you see a large banner with a name on it. Mark Teeden. Mark Teeden was one of the OG Magic artists from when the game first came out, most famous for drawing Emrakul, Chaos Orb, and Manavolt. But he also drew Sol Ring, the original Sol Ring that hasn't been printed since the 90s. You wander over to his booth and see that he's out to lunch for the next half hour, so you devise a plan. You scour the nearby booths looking for a copy of Sol Ring. Depending on the edition and condition of the card, it can go anywhere from $10 to a few $100. You find one for $9, peer down at the text Mark Teeden along the bottom of the frame, and then look over at his booth. He's back, and a line has formed. Next to Mark is a woman who's handling the transactions as people hand Mark cards to sign. It's $2 to $5 depending on how fancy you want his signature to be. You're sweating because you don't know if he'll take a drawing request, or if he'll even know what you're talking about. He looks tired, and he doesn't talk to the people online as he signs their cards. The woman next to him is making small talk with whoever's at the front of the line, but Mark isn't saying much. She tells the people in front of you that it's Mark's birthday. You start to shake as you get closer, hoping beyond hope that this isn't going to crash and burn in the most embarrassing way possible. That's what I was going through as I got to the front of the line. I held my card up to Mark, the back facing him so he couldn't see what the card was, and asked him the hardest question that I've ever asked any celebrity in my life. "Have you ever seen the Blues Brothers?" Mark looked up at me. "Yes," he said. That was really all he said. I flipped my card around and handed it to him. "Could you, possibly draw the Blues Brothers on my Sol Ring so that they can be soul men?" Mark looked down at the card, then looked back up at me. And that's when he started singing. "I'm a Sol Ring, do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do." He did it. He actually did it. Without any prompt from me and no background knowledge of me and my friends, he sang the exact same line in the exact same way that me and my friends had been singing for a decade. He grabbed a black pen and took out his phone. He Googled the Blues Brothers and started to tell me a story. He said he took band in high school, and his band teacher made them all Blues Brothers shirts. There's a famous black and white image of the outline of the two, and he wanted to draw that exact image. He found it, he bent his head down, and he started to sketch. He used a thin pen for the outline and a wider one to fill in the colors. Then he took out a white marker for the negative space. As he drew, he kept talking, which is something he didn't do for anyone else in line. He told me that in high school he wore a fedora because he thought they were cool. He said he couldn't remember if it was because of the Blues Brothers or because of Indiana Jones, but one of the two movies had made him think that that was a good idea. He handed the card back to me after a few minutes, and he gave me a very friendly smile. In my nervousness, I forgot to shake his hand, although I don't know if artists want people shaking their hands all day long anyway, but I did thank him and tell him happy birthday, and I walked away with what is now the centerpiece of my magic collection. I have an original printing copy of Jace the Mind Sculptor, which is probably the most famous Magic card, and if you don't play the game, that's probably the one you're most likely to have heard of. I have sealed boxes of my favorite sets, and a box of alternate anime art cards from Japan because I'm a filthy weeb. But none of these even come close to how much I appreciate this card. The card itself doesn't matter. I paid $9 for it from Star City Games and had it in my possession for all of 7 minutes before handing it off to Mr. Teeden. But I will never, ever forget the stories that man told me. I'll never forget meeting one of the most celebrated artists of this game that I love, on his birthday, and having him sing Soul Man to me. That's just priceless. And I wanted to make this video to say thanks to Mr. Mark Teeden for making my decade so far. Years and years from now, if I ever move out of my hometown and stop playing Magic and stop seeing my old high school friends for our weekly EDH games, I'll always have this one-of-a-kind card to look at and remember all of those old times. And that's why I made this video, because to me, stories are the most important things that we can hold on to, and I thought that I would share mine.